And now for something completely different. I'm going to be talking about consumer capitalism, which is the dominant economic, social and cultural system around the globe, a system that has been extraordinarily successful at wealth creation over many centuries. But what I want to suggest is that consumer capitalism as a system is beginning perhaps to approach its use-by date. That it's beginning perhaps to be a little worn out, a little tatty around the edges, and is no longer perhaps in a position to deal with a number of new problems that we face in the 21st century. Let me just give a very brief overview of what I think some of those problems are, and they encompass a broad range of things. Firstly, economic problems. If you think about how consumer capitalism works as an economic model, it's predicated on the idea of continual economic growth. The idea that we must always, within an economy, be able to grow more and more. We must always produce more, consume more, continually and infinitely into the future. It can never imagine a time where we will sort of sit back and say, okay, we've got enough stuff, let's think about doing something else. It can never conceive of that moment. Now, that's a problem in many ways because it comes up against the finite nature of life on Earth. And here I'm not just talking about the finite nature of resources, the fact that we have a limited amount of agricultural land, of water, of minerals, of energy supplies. I'm talking about something that's much more difficult to dislodge in terms of its finite nature, and that's time. Specifically, the amount of time we have on this Earth. Time is now, in the 21st century, a problem for consumer capitalism. Back in the 1950s, economists and others wrote about their economy, back in the United States, for example, as being an affluent society, a time when they imagined, looking forward into the second half of the 20th century, we might start to look at pursuing non-material goals. The idea was that we've got a lot of stuff now, maybe now we can think about other ways, other forms of human progress. But they got that spectacularly wrong, and the next few decades were a period of extraordinary economic growth. By the 1970s, those of us in the developed world had a fantastic array of choice of goods available. But even then, compared with now, it was almost an age of austerity. There are now 5 times as many products on the shelves of supermarkets as there were back in 1975. Now, that creates a new set of problems for us, because we only have a limited amount of time available to deal with this extraordinary proliferation of commodities. Let me give you a very brief example. We went into a local supermarket in Cardiff and literally counted the number of different brands of products available for some basic commodities. And we found, when we looked at shampoos and conditioners, that there were 188 different brands of shampoos and conditioners to choose from in that one supermarket on that one day. Now, how are we as consumers able to cope with that? If you were going to make a seriously rational, informed decision about which shampoo and conditioner to buy, you would have to do weeks, months of serious research. Now, what that means is that most of us, in a very ironic way, really, make a kind of rational decision. We make the rational decision that we are going to give up attempting to be a rational consumer, that it's simply not a good use of our time. Now, when that happens, the rational consumer is very much at the heart of a model of consumer capitalism. Once we, as consumers, no longer become rational consumers, the whole system loses, if you like, the thing that's at the soul of it, that's at the heart of it. Choice, from that point of view, and this is something that many psychologists and economists have studied with increasing detail, really, and sophistication. Choice now in the 21st century ceases to become an opportunity and begins to become a burden because of the extraordinary proliferation of commodities. The second problem has to do with a sort of social aspect, and that is to do with quality of life. There's been an increasing volume of research on quality of life, looking at what it is that makes life fulfilling, happy, contented, inspiring, challenging, meaningful, and so on. And what that research shows is that indeed, if you increase the amount of wealth in an economy, when you're at a sort of poorer level, it does increase quality of life. There's no doubt about that. But once you reach a certain level of affluence in a society, that relationship between the amount of money in the economy and the quality of life that you experience comes to a grinding halt. It's perhaps the most startling finding of the research, and it's been repeated in many different findings. Essentially, we reached a point probably about 20 years ago where economic growth no longer has any impact on our quality of life at all. Now, that's a pretty striking finding, and I think it gives us huge pause for thought. And what it suggests, indeed, some of this work, is that real quality of life, the things that really have meaning and benefit to us, are things that are sort of separate from the material world. They're in human relationships, social relationships. And many studies have actually found that people who are too immersed in consumerism actually begin to turn away from the things that actually do make us happy or fulfilled. And in fact, they begin to become more miserable as a result. Hence, the kind of retail therapy of the shopping mall is a kind of stasis. It's never really going to get any better than it is now. The third problem is environmental. And there are many environmental problems that come about from having this extraordinary productive capacity that consumer capitalism has been so successful at generating. All sorts of environmental consequences that come from that. But perhaps the most serious of these is something that scientists became increasingly alarmed about in the 1980s across the globe. And those scientists came together, brought together by the United Nations in the 1980s, to pool their work and produce a definitive report on the state of climate change. And essentially their first report back in 1990 gave all kinds of warnings that suggested that if we continued on our current path, then life on Earth could become extremely difficult and almost uninhabitable unless we changed the way we did things. They released many subsequent reports since then till now. And what have we done in response to that? Well, very little. In fact, since they released that first report, we've added to the quantity of global carbon emissions by 40%. It's almost as if we're playing a kind of game of brinksmanship with the science. We're going to push it that little bit further until we reach a breaking point, until we reach a point of no return. And climate scientists are now extremely concerned that that point of no return is only years away. So, if we take those problems together, we can begin to see that consumer capitalism as a model is starting to creak around the edges. It's economically not sustainable. Socially, it's unable to deliver on the promise of improving quality of life. And environmentally, it may even be threatening that quality of life. Now, the question I think that we should then ask, and I think this is in some ways the question for the 21st century, is why aren't we thinking more about that? Why aren't we thinking, well, maybe we need to re-adapt, we need to rethink the way we organize economic and social life in certain kinds of ways? And why aren't we putting more energy into those kinds of thoughts? Well, I want to suggest that there are several reasons for that, but I just want to give two. And they're both to do with the way we organize our media systems currently. The first has to do with the media and telecommunications industry in general. Now, this is an important industry. Economically, it's important. It's around 7% of global gross domestic product and rising. But it's more important, I think, because of its social impact. This is an industry that dominates our waking hours in a way that no other does. A study in the United States in 2009 found that the average American spent 68 hours a week consuming media. Now, that's an extraordinary ability of one industry to dominate consciousness. That's more time than we would spend in any other activity during our waking hours, more time than most of us would spend working. Now, that's something that is an issue, I think, because of the genius of the media and telecommunications industry to encapsulate a certain kind of profit model. What that industry, I think, has become incredibly good at in recent decades is something we might call planned obsolescence. The ability to persuade us that we have to keep buying things at an ever-increasing rate. So, for example, if we think about a technology like the phone, there was a time when you'd buy a phone, it would last 10 years. In fact, If you think about a phone from the 1960s, the design of that phone is almost emblematic of the 1960s. It symbolizes a decade. Now the average lifespan of a phone is about 12 to 18 months. And when we dump the phones that we have, they're normally in perfect working order. Television. One of my daughter's favorite TV shows is the sitcom Friends. That's a sitcom that lasted 10 years. Now, if you were watching Friends and paying attention to developments in technology, you probably would have changed the TV set on which you were watching Friends 3 or 4 times. First, because the shape changed that way, then the shape changed that way, then it was a different kind of, went from analog to digital, and other kinds of technologies that changed the definition of the image. Computers now are locked into a cycle of upgrade around software and hardware, symbiotic with one another, that requires us to be on a constant cycle of replacement, ever more rapid cycle of replacement. Now, all of those things have a huge environmental impact, of course. They're very full of toxic chemicals in the production and disposal of all those things. But more importantly, in some ways, I think, is the social impact that this industry has on the way we think. What it tells us, I want to suggest, is that progress, human progress, is bound up with the constant consumption of objects. And that progress is not about producing something of quality that might last a while, that can be adapted and changed. It's about buying something and dumping it as quickly as possible to replace it with something new. Obsolescence, from that point of view, as Jonathan Stern once said, in this industry is not only planned but forced and engineered, and incredibly skillfully. It's a kind of genius in a way. Apple now has a business model which means that the moment it puts a product on the market, it's working on replacing that product in a period of around 12 to 18 months. The second way in which I think our media system perhaps pushes us towards a certain way of thinking is through our dominant cultural industry. And our dominant cultural industry, more important really than any other, is the advertising industry. This is an industry that's colonized almost every space that we have. It colonizes spaces in terms of our natural environment, our planned environment, but it also has captured spaces across all our media industries. So if you think of something like television, for example, in countries like this, when television began, it was a completely non-commercial medium. Now, most TV stations are full of commercials, and they have more commercials on them per hour than they have had at any point in human history. If we think of something like the film industry in the 1970s, the film industry just produced films. Now it produces vehicles for selling advertising. There's not a film that comes out of Hollywood that hasn't got a slew of product placement and product tie-in deals. Think about computers. When the internet was created, it was this extraordinary civic space for the exchange of information, ideas, and so forth. And it still is that space, but now it's chock full of advertising. And its dominant model is that advertising will pop up everywhere you go, or most places that you go on it. So ads are everywhere, and there are a few spaces left where there is no advertising. And there are parts of the natural world, if you look up to the night sky, that no ads there. Well, maybe for not much longer. The technology now exists to be able to beam up through lasers logos onto a full moon in the sky at night. So, this may be coming to your night sky sometime quite soon. If that's a troubling thought, it's perhaps not a surprising thought, because the number of spaces in which advertising now colonizes is extraordinary. Now, one of the great ironies here, of course, is that the more stuff you have, the harder the advertising industry needs to work. So the more stuff we have, the more advertising needs to tell us that we need to buy yet still more. It's a more and more difficult sell with every year that goes by. And that means that global advertising spend continues to go up. Over the last 10 years, it's gone up considerably. It's now around $500 billion per year in terms of global spend, all to persuade us to buy more things. Now, ads, of course, individually tell lots of different kinds of stories. But if we think about advertising collectively, advertising tells us in some ways one story. What it tells us is that all forms of human happiness, popularity, respect, status, security, anything that we desire, can be found in only one place, and that is the world of consumption. It can be found nowhere else. So what advertising is, in a way, is a kind of unwitting, unplanned propaganda system for a certain way of organising our lives through consumerism. Now, I want to end really just by just asking you to imagine a couple of slightly different kinds of futures. One is a future where we shift the way we subsidise things. Currently, we subsidise the kind of world of production and consumption. So when things are produced or when they're consumed and thrown away, who picks up the tab for disposing of the waste, for dealing with all the mess that it creates? Well, the public does. It's done through the public purse. So we subsidise that activity. Suppose we shifted that subsidy and instead gave that money to people whose job it was to repair things. I mean, it's very rare to see people who repair things these days. The shop on the corner that used to repair things has often disappeared. But supposing we subsidised that activity and we made it profitable to make things that were built to last or that could be adapted when new technologies came along, we'd have a very different set of circumstances. Or imagine instead if the enormous creative energy that goes into the advertising industry, I mean, fantastic creative energy, fantastic talent that goes into creating all sorts of advertising. Imagine if everybody involved in that industry was told suddenly, you no longer have to tell stories around consumption. You can tell any story about human experience that you wish. Any story that comes into your head that you can imagine. Stretch our imaginations. The world would automatically become a rather different place. And we would begin, perhaps, to be able to imagine a different future and a different way of realising human progress. Thank you.